Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss of internet shitlords. And today I'm talking to you about, well, first off, you guys, those of you who've watched my previous videos have seen I've done at least a couple of videos where I talk about how basically humans are the most interesting race to play, and that, you know, your favorite race sucks unless it's a human, and things like that. Obviously, in my medieval authentic games, in games like Dark Albion or Sword and Caravan, I have the only character race is human, right? But this is not what I meant to say. At least what Wizards is now doing to demi-humans is not what I had meant by that. It's in fact the opposite of that. But it is in fact what they are doing in OneDnD is a fundamental change, wherein now they haven't gotten rid of non-human races, but essentially every single non-human race is really just a human doing cosplay. That's it. And you know, we talked before about the fact that they've gotten rid of things like alignment issues with certain races, right? Like the Drow are no longer evil and things like that. And that racial modifiers no longer exist. Now it's entirely, you know, special abilities or attribute benefits are generated by background, they say, right? And background means basically nothing, right? Like background, like in my games, background is background events that are rolled randomly, you know, in Lion and Dragon or in Baptism of Fire. You have a random roll when you create your character that gives you one background event of like what happened at some point before your character creation. So like when your character was a child or a young person or whatever, a youth, or in earlier adulthood, that gives you, sometimes it gives you some kind of a skill bonus is the most common thing, or maybe a modifier to reaction, or maybe some interesting campaign detail like your character got an inheritance or he was from a family that had been stripped of their title or something like that, right? So interesting background detail. That's what background is. But background is not something that should give you inherent benefits that are, you know, a product of your, of the circumstances of your birth, right? Like that's race or culture at most, right? Like you could say that, well, you have characters from different cultures that will have certain specific skills or traits or talents that are important in that culture. Background means nothing, right? But this video is not about that subject. It's about the latest thing that they've pointed out now, that they've done in OneDnD, which is that now, because of a question of equity, none of the demi-human races have any disadvantages. Okay? So here's the thing. No demi-human race has inherent racial abilities. No demi-human race has inherent disabilities, right? Or disadvantages by their race, right? None of them have specific talents or skills based by race, right? Everything has just been made into a neutral gray mush. And so the entire definition of race now, in the new version of D&D, in the OneDnD edition, is that it is a human that looks weird, right? Because they're, in every other respect, they're identical to humans, right? They might have some special power, but so could a human, apparently. Like there shouldn't be, according to them, there should be nothing that one of them can do that the others can't, right? In theory, at least. And so they've removed, because this is how races worked in the old days, right? In the beginning of D&D, you had humans and you had elves, dwarves, and hobbits at first, but then they were legally required to change that to halflings. So basically you had the good races from Tolkien, right? And these races each had their own specific characteristics, right? Hobbits were very good at hiding and sneaking, and they were fairly resistant. They were good at saving throws and stuff like that. And dwarves were particularly tough in certain aspects, particularly, again, they had good saving throws. They were good warriors and so on and so forth. Elves and dwarves had infravision. Dwarves could also detect hidden doors and things like that in underground complexes, because as dwarves they lived underground, right? And elves were very good, very, very good at sneaking in natural wilderness areas, and that sort of thing, right? And they also had certain limitations. For one thing, they couldn't get higher than a certain level, because although they looked human-ish, they weren't like humans. Humans are uniquely adaptable. That was the superpower humans had instead of those other things, right? Like elves could both fight and do magic, right? Humans couldn't do that. You were either a magic user or a fighter. But elves could be both. But they couldn't get to as high a level as a human could. Humans had certain lack of certain special abilities, but they were in fact the ones that were the most versatile. They could be the most number of classes, and they could get to the highest possible level in those classes. And so this became an element of a decision-making process, right? And in terms of games, because there's two issues here. There's the question of playability, and there's the question of what it is saying about the world, right? So in terms of playability, a player would have to decide, any race that they pick is going to have certain advantages over the others and certain disadvantages. Humans don't get as much cool, special kind of abilities, but they get to go to higher levels, and they can have a bigger range of choices of what class they want to be in, stuff like that. Whereas the demi-humans have certain special abilities. They're in many ways, especially at lower levels, they're superior to humans in certain ways, but they ultimately have level limits, and also some of them have some disadvantages, right? Like halflings are not able to run as fast as humans do, or as, for that matter, as elves do. So this is an important difference. In later times, they added other races. Of course, there have ultimately been tons of different races that at some point or another were character races, And the important thing is that each one of these were, in some form or another, definitely not humans. That's kind of the point, right? They are not meant to be just another type of human. They tend to have some type, in some way or another, of a element of non-humanness that was expected of the character to play out. So, a half-orc was someone who had a bestial side to his nature that he had to either embrace or try to rein in, depending on his choice of alignment, usually. And then you had, a variety of other races that would have had similar types of elements of decision-making, You had some variants like Kender who were, well, in terms of actual gameplay, they were made for the most annoying player in the group to decide to play that and then make life miserable for everybody else, right? But they were basically, they were a race of halflings that were kind of these weirdo kleptomaniacs, Same thing with, like, for example, Tinker Gnomes who were frustrated inventors, right? These are characters that were therefore actually less multidimensional than humans. That's always been the one aspect of the non-human races, right? That they have something that makes them less versatile, less complete as an entity, let's say, than a human, but that is then overemphasized to compensate for that, Another very good example was the original version of the Tiefling. The Tiefling was cursed with demon blood, and that gave them benefits, right? Like they could do magic and stuff. And this comes out of, like, medieval lore, right? And in medieval lore, for example, most famously, the wizard Merlin was a Cambion, which is the medieval term for a Tiefling. He was the product of physical congress between his mother and a devil. And he would have been doomed to be a great evil in the world had it not been that he was immediately baptized after his birth. And so this gave him the freedom to not be purely evil, So instead, he became a very powerful magician. Of course, one of the reasons why he was the most powerful magician was still because he had the blood of a demon inside him, right? But he was now not bound to do evil. And in the case of, like, tieflings, originally, in the earlier versions where they appear of D&D, they're characters that are essentially cursed with their demonic nature, and they have to struggle against it. And of course it gives them benefits, but then there's the downside, right? One of the things that they're doing now is that if you're playing a demi-human, there is no downside. There's also no real upside. It's just a colorful costume you're wearing. This is really the dumbest and most opposite version of what my argument would be, right? I would say, in general, in most of my games, except of course the Gonzo ones, in most of my games, I say you should play a human because the humans have the widest variety of characteristics and options. They're the kind of characters that are always going to be, if you're playing a game that involves role playing, they're going to be the deepest characters, because the other ones, if you're playing them right, should not be as deep. They should be in some form kind of archetypal or stereotypical of that demi-human race, because that race isn't meant to be as versatile as a human, right? Non-humans should be alien by definition. And instead, what Wizards of the Coast has done is a product of their woke thinking, right? They have this, and I mean, this is the surface level element of it, is basically that they look at everything through the lens of race Marxism, right? This kind of racial hierarchy status, where they have to associate groups into oppressor and oppressed. And so to them, in the context of the RPG, humans are obviously white people, right? that this is because everything is either white people or not white people, right? And the white people are oppressing the not white people in some form. So the not white people have to be able to get the upper hand with the help of the woke people. But to them now, all humans are white people in the context of D&D. I want you to understand what that, what it's meant by that, right? Because which reveals that something really sick about their own prejudices, right? Ironically, the people who whine the most about how white normativity is the worst thing in the world are the people that are the biggest believers in white normativity. Almost no one else buys that nonsense, right? Them and, the actual Klansmen and things like that are the only people who buy that nonsense. But they do. They absolutely believe it. To the point that in D&D, they look at a human and they say, that's a white person. And then they look at some green-skinned lizard man and say, well, that's obviously a Native American, right? Like, that's how their mentality works, right? So to them, that is the reason why they say, well, no, we can't, this is dehumanizing of these people, these races of make-believe things that we are deciding are somehow clearly meant to represent non-white races, which is obvious nonsense. It's complete crap, right? Because, of course, in D&D, you have all human races, in theory, in a setting, and certainly in the established settings like Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms, there are many different skin colors of humans, right? And demi-humans were never, ever meant to represent that, right? They are meant to represent, from the context of heroic legend and heroic myth, different sorts of virtues and vices that are put into a physical form, right? Into the form of a creature that represents, maybe nobility, maybe avarice, right? Maybe pride, maybe kindness, who knows, right? But like that have these traits that are monotone and taken to an extreme beyond what a normal human would have, right? And then there are a few who are just simply really alien, right? They don't, that their purpose is to basically show something that is just outside of human reason, right? So in my, Gonzo Fantasy Companion, I have a generator for mutant humans. And those are humans that have weird skin colors for the most part. Some of them have some unusual mutant powers. Some of them are psychic. A lot of them are very weird. And of course, some of them are kind of goofy because it's Gonzo Fantasy, right? And there's a generator you can roll to generate different kinds, different groups of mutant humans. Right? And those are still humans. They're just humans that have become mutated into something weird, right? And mostly they're just humans with kind of a weird skin tone, right? Like a really weird alabaster white with a third eye, right? Or it could be, something else, a pink mutant or a mutant that's covered in shaggy fur or something like that, right? But they're still basically humans. But then I also have a weird fantasy creature generator, and those are not human at all, right? They're really bizarre. Now, being a Gonzo campaign or a Gonzo book, right? This Gonzo Fantasy Companion is a source book that lets you add a whole bunch of interesting generators for all kinds of interesting things like magic items and creatures and dungeon complexes and many other things, kitchen sinks, all sorts of stuff, food, high-tech items, etc., into your campaign. There is going to be some element of humor in that, right? And that will include sometimes having inhuman creatures doing surprisingly human things. So in my campaign, usually when they do those human things, they do them wrong, or they do them in some way that no normal human would do them normally, right? So there's a character here in the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, because another thing you can do is you can generate intelligent animals in the Gonzo Fantasy Companion. And this is a character from the Gonzo campaign, my Last Sun campaign, it was an NPC. It was called Space Bear, right? And he was a bear who had a dream of becoming an astronaut and became absolutely obsessed with that, and eventually did become an astronaut, and then became kind of a Chewbacca parallel for another character who had become like a kind of a Han Solo sort of figure, right? There's also some very very weird, very interesting romance with one of the player characters, with Sammy the cleric. She was very interested in Space Bear when she realized he was intelligent, right? He couldn't really talk in common, but he was actually an intelligent bear, right? So then she had strange feelings about it. But anyways, enough about female cleric / bear lust. The point I'm getting to there is that, that's another kind of example that you would have this, so Space Bear is, in some ways, he has this dream to fly into the sky, right? To fly into the void. And he has technical know-how and stuff like that. But then he's also a bear, right? He does bear things like a bear would, right? So this is, and you can generate Space Bear using the Gonzo Fantasy Companion. So this is like the opposite of what Wizards is doing, right? In the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, the weird race generator and the intelligent animal generator will create creatures that are not human and that are very different than human. They have different limitations and different benefits. In Wizards of the Coast now, they have made it clear that, for example, any of the races that used to have problems with sunlight no longer do, right? So a dark elf or whatever, a drow or whatever you have it, won't take damage from being in the sunlight, right? Or won't take penalties from being in heavily lighted areas, right? And, all sorts of stuff like that. Tieflings, obviously, they have no consequence whatsoever to being half demon blood, right? Like there's that whole element of the kind of moral struggle that a tiefling had is just gone now, right? Because that's especially bad, because the left think demons are good, right? So that's got to be right out. If anything, they should be like put up in a higher pedestal, which in fact they are, because ironically, in a pattern that has been very visible in a lot of their activism for some time, a lot of the queer D&D people hold up tieflings as like, this is us, this is our people, right? Which is very telling in certain ways, right? And you have all of that sort of nonsense, and you even have, and I kid you not, right? The fact that there is no movement penalty for shorter races, Okay, so like now a halfling is exactly as fast at running as a human. And I'm sorry, but like this is again part of leftist ideology is that you create your own reality, right? That's part of the kind of this kind of postmodernism, the relativism of the postmodernist movement that actually believes there is no such thing as reality. Reality is just narrative, and if your narrative changes, your reality changes, and so you can declare yourself the fastest 3-foot tall runner in the world, right? And then you will be, right? Because you identify as that. So, that's how they're thinking through this. But I mean, in real life, if you got the world's fastest midget and you put him up against a standard, 100-yard dash runner, a normal-sized athlete, there is no way he would win, right? Okay, and you might say, oh, well, but hang on, but, midgets have some of their proportions because of the nature of how they were born are not really correct, and of course that would give them a disadvantage. But halflings aren't midgets, bigot. Okay, fair enough, right? But then, what else can you compare to? Well, you could say a halfling is about the size of, let's say, an 8-year-old child. I'm guessing around there, right? So you could imagine you had an 8-year-old, very healthy, fit human, right? That was raised almost from birth by a psychotic parent who was obsessed with their kid being the fastest runner in the world, right? The dad had been on the verge of becoming an Olympian, and then in a tragic bear-related accident, he lost all of his limbs, and then he became this bitter, horrifying creature that just insisted that his kid spend every waking hour training for the 100-yard dash, right? So that 8-year-old has been physically directed his entire life to run that 100-yard dash. You put him up against a fully mature adult runner, a human runner, the kid will get creamed, right? Like there's no way he'll get, because it's a simple question of physical reality, right? His legs are shorter. His legs are too short to catch up to the fully grown human, right? That's just a basic element of material reality. It is not bigotry. It's not oppression that kid is not going to be able to beat the adult in a physical race, to say nothing about, the difference in racing between men and women, regardless of what a woman wants to imagine or what a man wants to not imagine, right? These are just physical realities. But in Wizards of the Coast, they've decided they're going to ignore all of those, right? And why? Well, because they say it's oppression, right? It's an oppression. To them, it's an oppression in multiple ways, right? Because obviously, to them, halflings are midgets. Halflings are little people, right? They're just a metaphor, or they just represent disabled peoples, right? And so it's oppression to suggest that they couldn't possibly do everything exactly as well as a human, which is again a white man to them, right? Or also it's oppression of players, because for players it's no fun for them to have any limitations at all, right? And we've heard this to the point that there are people that have been saying recently also from the 5e crowd that a DM should never be allowed to do a surprise attack on a player, right? Or to have a player just die in a battle without consent, right? And things like that, right? So there's this idea that the player should never have anything happen to their character that they don't want happening to their character. And I guess the place that starts, in their point of view, is that they should get to pick to play a halfling, but not have that halfling not be able to run as fast as a fully grown, physically competent human, right? But at that point, then you're not really playing a halfling, are you? You're just playing a human that looks short for some reason. That human that looks short has no traits that make them halfling, right? They don't get any special benefits or penalties for being halflings, right? This is just turned into a ridiculous pantomime, right? Every single race in D&D is now just a human in a costume. That's it. Or a human in makeup, whatever you prefer, right? A human wearing pointy ears. In whatever case, they're just all humans. And that is the worst possible result. Because now what you have is a bunch of humans in makeup who feel that because of their makeup, they don't actually have to be interesting because they think the makeup makes them interesting, except they've stripped anything interesting about the supposed person they're claiming to be because they still just act like any other human. So it's just absolutely disastrous, right? It's the dumbest thing imaginable. And it's actually the worst result in terms of both player enjoyment and in terms of of creating a game that will represent a heroic fantasy mold that is what most players actually want to experience, right? They want to be heroes. And that's the other thing, right? I said at the beginning that the first thing that they are thinking of is this hierarchy of oppression, and they're imagining that, if you say that elves have a con penalty, it's like saying that Asians, have some kind of a strength, less strength than a white person or whatever, right? Something like that, right? It's something ridiculous. But underlying that, it is also about the deconstruction of the heroic mythic symbology of the West, which is just as dangerous. It's in fact more dangerous in many ways, because it's saying that actually nothing should be special. No one should be a hero. There is nothing that makes a human different from something that is inhuman. There's nothing that makes good better than evil. There's nothing that differentiates good or evil. In fact, there's no such thing as either of those, right? And so all you're left with is a mush that is only suitable for having, adventures about your sex life being a hot mess at college, right? Or about going to eat, pray, love tours in third world countries where you can feel like a white savior, and stuff like that, right? This is really the pathetic bottom of the barrel, and it removes anything of a philosophical or of a symbolic value or a moral value to the game you are playing. So it gets everything wrong. Anyways, I guess that's everything I had to say about this subject. Check out the Fantasy Companion if you haven't yet, the Gonzo Fantasy Companion. It's on drive-thru. The links of all my products are in the description below if you expand that description. Gonzo Fantasy Companion is a great product that has all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff that you can add to your campaign, particularly if you're running a high fantasy or a weird fantasy campaign with varying levels of humor. Check out my other products. Wilderlands, if you've got Sword and Caravan, you should pick up Wilderlands to get the tables that you need for when your characters decide to go off the Silk Road. Dark Albion Cults of Chaos. Speaking of random generators, this is probably one of the best random generator books I've ever made, which allows you to generate in minutes a complete adventure with an enemies group and all the details about them and all of the kind of complications and plot points that you need. Plus lots of details about, different forms of evil cults in medieval authentic play. And all my other stuff, Baptism of Fire, of course, which has been #1 for 8 weeks in a row and is still selling really, really well and been recommended by so many people, which I'm very grateful for. And also, in the Red Room store, check out the Pundit Files, my newest periodical. The new one comes out every 2 weeks. The latest one is number 17, Merry Men and Sherwood, which gives you a guide to the different versions of Robin Hood over the course of the medieval stories about Robin Hood, and presents them in a real life kind of format, in a medieval authentic kind of format, with a lot of detail about the Sherwood Forest and its environs in the context of the Albion setting, and some plot hooks, including the possibility that one of your player characters will be the next Robin Hood. So it's a very interesting little book, and like all of the issues of the Pundit Files, it only costs $3.50. So go down to the Red Room store, check out all 17 of the Pundit Files. Any one of them can be yours if you can get someone to give you $3.50. All right? And I guess that's everything for today. Currently smoking. This is an oversized Peterson Poker plus Argento Natural.